I'm Rock. I'm your host. I have a podcast called Rock's World where I talk about some of these things, but not just politics, because life is not always just politics and race. And that's me. I won't really, this is not about me, this is about our esteemed guests, Mr. Coleman Hughes, Kmele Foster, and I'll let them sort of introduce themselves and kind of discuss a little bit what they are into before we get into the discussion.
I'm Coleman Hughes. I'm a philosophy student at Columbia University and a writer, and I'm a columnist for Quilette.com, and I write about race issues.
Howdy, Kmele Foster. I am a partner at something called Confronting. We're a media company. We produce all sorts of great original content. In addition to that, I do some public policy and social commentary in various contexts. The podcast called Confronting. I do media stuff all over the place, and I'm delighted to chat with you all today. So special thanks to our hosts, who I'm not sure if you had any opening remarks.
I did. I was going to let Rob kind of say.
Okay, cool.
So, again, this discussion is brought to you by Quilette, New York, and let's just get into it. The very first question that I want to pose to you gentlemen, is why is this discussion important? Why is race and politics so important? Why are we discussing this?
Well, I think race is one of the topics that, in my experience, makes people most emotional and sometimes least rational. And I just think there's a set of orthodoxies, mostly coming out of the left, that some of which are based in truth, some of which aren't, and the discussion around those orthodoxies has been shut down largely by the fear of, essentially the fear of being called racist from a non-black perspective. Among black people, it's often more the fear of being labeled a sellout or not authentically black. And those, there are taboos around all kinds of topics, so it's not unique to race, but I think it's uniquely, the level of the taboo and the fierceness of it, I think, is unique to race, and we just want our beliefs to be in register with reality, and so far as taboos are getting in the way of that, then it matters to break those taboos and break them consciously.
I think humans have a tendency to think about themselves in terms of tribes, right? And if we're talking about politics, it's impossible to imagine a conversation about politics that doesn't involve nation states. It's the various things that make us different, that separate us from one another. Over the course of the last couple of centuries, and certainly since the founding of this country, there's probably not been anything in concept that's been more clearly a delineator of human beings, at least in our minds and imagining, than race. And it's still something that I think is at the forefront of most people's minds. It is lurking in the back of most conversations in our politics and in our culture as well. So it is unavoidable that we have to address race in the context of conversations about politics and various other issues. My goal in most cases is to try to find ways to enrich those conversations. And it's generally by pointing out the various ways in which people generalize and oversimplify really complicated but important things. Sometimes the problems we're dealing with, sometimes they're solutions they're imagining, but oftentimes race serves to be an obstruction to us getting a more sophisticated understanding of these things.
Okay. The first question that I want to pose to you gentlemen is about the black or the African American community in this country. Race and politics really tend to focus around these two groups because they are, by and large, the largest groups historically in this country. A lot of our history is centered around the relations between the predominant white population and the black population. We understand a lot of the history, but after the revolution, excuse me, not the revolution, the War. The Civil War and Reconstruction, there began to be a divergence between the black population and the Republican Party that they almost overwhelmingly supported. And a lot of that, just a little context, over the 20th century, beginning in the early 1900s, there were a series of calculations by the Republican Party to pursue more votes. There were more white people, and so they pursued, as any product or any party trying to sell something, they pursued the easiest way to victory. They took some stances on anti-lynching laws. They took some stances on, segregation, different things, and the split between the Republican Party that did a lot in terms of abolition work, freeing slaves and different things. And so now we find ourselves at this point in time when black identification with the Republican Party is at, I believe, under 10%. So what I want to ask you gentlemen is, what can the Republican Party do to reform the ties with the black community, do more outreach? How can the Republican Party present its message to correct what some feel is an imbalance?
I'm not sure that Republicans can do all that much at this point. I think when you have someone like Trump after Charlottesville equivocating or seeming to equivocate about the ethics of white supremacy versus anti-fascist activism, when the person who was killed by a white supremacist, right? I mean, you could argue about the validity of claiming that there was bad people on both sides. Obviously, as a factual statement, that's true. But in the wake of something like that, one generally just condemns the killer and not both sides, right? So that episodes like that, in conjunction with a huge historical, cultural sensitivity around incidences of racism. Those tend to be mistakes that can't be remedied, in the sense that I can't imagine what the Republican Party could do to say could do or say necessarily that would get a lot more of the black vote, given some of those kind of episodes. And obviously this also speaks to beliefs in the black community about the prevalence of racism. So again, it's not clear to me that there is that much the Republican Party could do, other than trying not to make political gaffes like that. Short of that, it's not clear to me that politics is the most useful tool for improving black outcomes on many metrics of success.
I would agree with a lot of that. I might qualify some of the stuff around, say, like the Donald Trump of it all in Charlottesville, only to say that there is an established narrative, a very well-established narrative, when it comes to the racism that is endemic in the Republican Party and the ascendancy of Trump and the degree to which his popularity is a consequence of him appealing to white nationalist sentiments or racial resentment. Those narratives are very effective on the left, and I suppose they've served to reinforce what was already an astonishingly strong and consistent lead amongst conservatives, amongst liberals with blacks. The fact of the matter, however, is, and I mean, I don't have any advice for the Republican Party per se, I'm not a Republican, or conservative for that matter, I'm not one of those either. My politics are decidedly libertarian, and as such, I don't really have great representation in national politics. That said, when it comes to the stranglehold that progressives have on black voters, or at least the allegiance that black voters have to the Democratic Party, to place it another way, it's less perhaps conspiratorial sounding. It seems to me that a lot of the party identification almost is indistinguishable from just kind of an article of faith at this point. But there isn't much in the way of sophisticated political calculations that are happening, even in times historically when blacks who are in fact a great deal more evangelical. You might expect them to vote along with some of the folks on the religious right, have values that were consistent with them. They were still much more interested in voting with Democrats. Perhaps it's the legacy of the civil rights movement there. Perhaps that has something to do with the Southern strategy, which I've sometimes heard be overstated. The narrative is perhaps a bit more rigid than I think is probably historically accurate. But in either case, there is something about having the appropriate political orthodox views and being viewed as acceptably or sufficiently black. People who are conservative, people who deviate from the mean, it's not just that they are black people who happen to be Republicans. I mean, if you look at someone like Michael Steele, when he was visiting Morgan State University, he was having Oreos thrown at him. And that is the relationship there. And the cost of actually being a heterodox black thinker is very expensive, as I know Coleman has been experiencing of late, and has even discovered a little bit more in recent days. And we'll talk about that eventually.
One thing I would add there, just an interesting factoid from history. In the early 20th century, the NAACP released a statement to the effect that the progress of blacks would be contingent on their not showing allegiance to either party. NAACP couldn't say that today. I'm also not sure how true it is today. I mean, there's a logic to it, right? You want to be courted as a voter by politicians, so you want your vote to be seen as up for the taking. In any case, that shows you how far we've come.
With the lock that the Democratic Party has, and I'm using the Republican Party and the Democratic Party sort of as proxies for conservative thinking and liberal thinking. There's obviously a lot of gray area in there. We do see some problems within the black community that seems to be quite intractable. Is that the right word? I think so. Yeah. So how should the black community, what do you see or hear within the black community reconciling the fact that the last presidential nominee just 20 years ago was labeling my generation, my peers, as super predators, right? There is a very sordid history with the Democratic Party and some of the loose allegiances that they've played when power is at stake. So if you could just sort of touch on maybe some of the disappointments that the black community has with the Democratic Party.
I would say there are many policies that are favored by Democrats and liberals which have not been shown to be very effective, and often when evidence emerges that they don't work, the evidence tends to be ignored. So one would be affirmative action, for instance. It's far from clear that affirmative action is a net benefit either for black people specifically or for the nation as a whole. But you see consistently, you just ask for data from colleges about GPA differences between blacks and whites and Asians. Colleges just hide the data, which is to say, when you ask for the data that would settle the question of whether affirmative action is helping black people or hurting them or neutral, the data is not forthcoming. And that's not the behavior of people who are instituting a sound policy by ethical means. That's the behavior of people who have skeletons in their closet. There are other examples of this. People like Thomas Sowell have noted that the massive crime wave of the 70s and 80s was at least partially the result of so-called criminals' rights laws, which were very much favored by progressives of the era, and the crime rate spiked to unprecedented levels, and it's certainly reasonable to suspect that many black people and white people and people of all ethnicities might be alive if those particular policies hadn't been instituted. There are other examples of this. Sowell and the writer Jason Riley have documented the long history of minimum wage laws, pricing low-skilled black laborers out of the market. And obviously there's all of these policies, their effectiveness are empirical questions, and reasonable people can disagree about them. But I think that the jury is in that all of these policies have both costs and benefits. And it's a matter of weighing them. It's not a foregone conclusion that the costs outweigh the benefits. And what black people should be angry at the Democratic Party about is the failure to even, in many cases, mention the costs for black people.
Try to address some of the things you mentioned. You mentioned super predators, which I suspect is, at least in part, a reference to Hillary Clinton invoking the phrase during a speech while she was First Lady, which is an issue that was raised again in sort of newly woke America. The Black Lives Matter movement is good at injecting that issue into the zeitgeist and making it a thing. There is, when I look at the context for that, though, and here I am again, sort of revisiting history and trying to put things into context, I'm not at all certain that there's any compelling evidence that Hillary Clinton used that phrase referring to black people in particular. There's certainly been some conversation about what the researchers who coined the phrase were referring to in their work, and that's, I think, a separate matter. Suffice it to say, there have certainly been some pretty persistent social challenges that have been faced in predominantly black communities. They also happen to be predominantly urban communities that we're talking about. We're talking about high crime rates and things like that. I think the inability to find political solutions to those problems, however, has obviously not resulted in the Democratic Party losing much in the way of its influence. It's still managed to maintain a tremendous amount of power in the places where perhaps people have suffered the most, places like Detroit, Chicago, Baltimore. I'm not sure I can explain that any better than I already have. I'm not even certain that the sense of disappointment that seems to exist related to those things is likely to equate to much in the way of change. I will say that here again is a place where I often find that talking about even those particular problems that black communities tend to face, whether it's inability to get ahead and close the achievement gap with respect to education, or close the wealth gap with respect to income and prosperity, to talk about these problems narrowly with respect to the racial stratification, the racial differences, the group differences, almost certainly doesn't put us much closer to solutions. The solutions to many of these problems have very little to do with race, so far as I'm concerned. I think perhaps the number one thing that we could do to reduce the rate of violence in this country, which would directly benefit people who are the most likely to suffer homicide, is to get rid of the war on drugs, which is a racially agnostic policy that just makes sense to the extent that neither Democratic nor Republican parties fight for policies like that. I think is sort of evidence of why these problems don't get fixed. But unfortunately, it hasn't translated down to the mainstream yet, to the point where voters are demanding that sort of thing. Sometimes it's worth stating this as well. Mandatory minimum sentences, tough on crime laws. These are things that black voters were demanding during the first opioid epidemic, or the first heroin epidemic at any rate. The complaint used to be that you don't care about our neighborhoods, so you don't police them. As a consequence, they got some of the tougher on crime laws. They got some of the Clinton-era sort of 3 strikes laws. There were people who celebrated those laws, black people who supported those laws because they thought it would make their circumstances better. The degree to which it didn't, I think, is pretty palpable. The fact that no one suffers political punishment for it, beyond Hillary Clinton perhaps, in the last election, is also, I think, worth noting, and a bit difficult to reconcile with something, with people who perhaps have an expectation that our democracy is going to produce really efficient quality results.
Sure.
Let's talk about the white community. And I'm glad you brought up the opioid epidemic, scourge of drugs, and what, if some of you don't recall seeing in the past couple of weeks, there was a report put out by the U.S. Census that the white population, the non-Hispanic white population, is officially in decline. There are a number of factors for this. One being, the chief factor being that the white population is significantly older than some of the younger immigrant populations that have come to the country within the past 30 to 40 years. Beginning about 40 years ago and really sort of accelerating through now. There is also the situation with the opioid epidemic. Life expectancy has dropped, so that's contributed to the decline of the white population. How do you see this affecting politics and sort of feelings within society going forward as the historically dominant by numbers population begins to decrease?
That's a great question. I think, like you said, I think below a certain age, it's already the case that white people are no longer the majority in the country, which suggests that if demographic trends continue, sometime in my lifetime, it will no longer be a majority white country. And so the demographics, it seems, are all going in one direction. And what that suggests to me is that identity politics it's going to become increasly pernicious if it stays at its current level. Right? It just posit that X% of just to take two examples, X% of blacks and Hispanics are taken in by a certain strain of identity politics, which may seem like a sort of nitpicky thing to criticize. It may seem like we're just focusing on far left activists who don't have that much power and they're just in the universities. As the demographics go in the way they're going, that, given the same percentage of enthusiasm about identity politics will only get increasingly powerful. So I think that's one reason why it's important to criticize bad ideas even when they seem to be only held by a small amount of people, because I think history shows that you never know who will be in power tomorrow. And there's kind of modernity bias here too, where people tend to assume that things won't change all that much. Even people who are historically informed about how different the prevailing norms of the 1930s were. I was just mainstream as a progressive, for example, to be a eugenicist. Totally mainstream. 50 years later, it's mainstream as a progressive to blame every disparity on discrimination. Right? There couldn't be more polar opposite conclusions, and you never know what it's going to be like in 50 years. So I think the demographic point you make about trends just, to me, impresses the point of criticizing bad ideas, even if they're only held by
Well, I'm trying to remember sort of the specific composition of your question. We're supposed to be addressing.
So, I can clarify. We see this demographic trend where the white population is in decline, and it's just going to continue for a number of factors. None of it malicious or anything. It's just life. How do you see this change in the overall demographics of the country affecting politics and and relations between people?
Yeah, well, I'm going to disappoint you a little bit. I don't do like political forecasting in a lot of in general. I quit doing that after Donald Trump won the primary. I couldn't call it. I didn't know what was happening. I promised someone that I would pay them $100 and eat my hat. I welched on that particular bet, but I did give up forecasting altogether. So I really don't know. I'm not sure how that will play out. I have seen some different things with respect to the demographic trajectory of the United States that lead me to believe that perhaps we've overstated the speed with which the changes will take place in the United States. I will comment, however, on what is the very curious change that seems to be happening in our politics, the degree to which the populism does seem to be the dominant ethic of both political parties. And to extend some of the insights, or perhaps to disagree a little bit to make this interesting with Coleman, certainly true that there is a very distinct and pronounced bent towards identity politics on the left. Absolutely true. They're also just dominant amongst minority voters in this country. But it's also true that conservatives are no strangers to identity politics. When they have their black conservatives, they are all too happy to put them on a pedestal. They've attempted to do that with me at times in the past, disappoint them. So they're willing to play the game. There's certainly some prominent public persons, I can't quite say public intellectuals, who are out there peddling a brand of black conservative identity politics that I find pretty repugnant. And I think that's probably true all the way down the line, and it's worth acknowledging that, since FDR, interest group politics have been a thing. And again, for reasons that we've already discussed, the notion that race will continue to be some factor in our politics for years to come, even as the demography of the country changes, and even as we're blended in ways. I mean, even the definition of what white means in this country is something that has changed dramatically over time. And the fact of the matter is that some of these folks who were saying several generations from now, there'll be many more Latinos, they won't even self-identify in that way. I mean, who's to say? It's. I think that's probably a sufficient answer to the question given the two answers that are wrong.
Immigration. Immigration has been a huge topic, not just within the past 6 months, but going all the way back to when I was a child, Ronald Reagan. Immigrants used to be able, or I should say, a lot of people would come over the southern border, work for the day, go home. Mid-'80s and then mid-late 80s, early 90s, immigration really began to be a sticking point. And since that point in time, both Democratic and Republican presidents have been increasingly tough on immigration. The number of deportations has increased. Maybe people may or may not know this, but President Obama was was the largest deporter of illegal immigrants to this country. Over the last 2 years of his administration, he began to shift from a blanket deportation to sort of adding value to making a distinction between violent criminals and maybe some lower level offending criminals, making some priority versus others. Our current administration has sort of defaulted back to the norm of if you're in the country illegally, you have to leave. A consequence of that is that a lot of the Hispanics, they have family members, they have children who are American citizens, they have spouses who are American citizens. How do you think, with Hispanics being the face of what's going on with immigration, how do you, I know you don't like to prognosticate, but what do you see being the impact, or if you've heard anything, any discussions about how this is impacting politics from the Hispanic perspective?
Yeah, I'm going to disappoint you again, because I just don't know. I'm not at all sure how this will play out.
That's a fair, I think, in some of these discussions, I don't mean to cut you off.
Yeah.
In some of these discussions, everyone feels compelled to provide an answer, and I just want to sort of highlight this is the second time we've done it. If you don't have something necessarily clear to say or everything, but just saying, hey, you know what, that's not.
Well, this is why I don't do cable news every single night anymore. The expectation is that when you show up on television, you'll have an answer for everything. There are plenty of people you can hand them a check and they will manufacture an answer to a question or find an article that they can quote from. I'm not that guy. That said, I do have perspectives on the immigration issue, and I do think, as you pointed out, there's some really interesting phenomena with respect to the way the issue has evolved in this country and the way the party's positions on these issues have evolved in this country. It is certainly appropriate to point out Barack Obama's legacy with respect to deportation in this country. There's some nuance around that issue, but as I pointed out at some points in the past, 2014, a lot of us will remember sort of the year that Eric Garner and Mike Brown were killed. It was the ascendancy of sort of the Black Lives Matter movement. We also had a pretty severe immigration crisis in this country around the same time, which went under-discussed at the time, which parallels the current challenge that we've seen that the Trump administration is having. the Trump administration's approach, I don't think that's my fault. We'll keep going now. It's okay. But the Trump administration's challenge was these sort of child separation issues. On the other hand, the Obama administration was just kind of taking whole families and holding them together, which I suppose that's better. It's better, but only by a little bit. I think it's good that progressives are taking a much sterner stance on these issues, that they're interested in these issues for the moment while they are in the resistance. I hope that is a commitment on those issues that stays and remains. But I do think it's important, even for people like me who are generally very open borders, I don't have a problem with that label, to grapple with the challenges associated with a policy like that in a government where you do have a pretty rich and generous entitlement system, in a political system where the incentive to create the same sort of political rights for new entrants to the country could in fact shift your culture in some pretty dramatic and profound ways that do have some consequence. And to take note of the challenges that have been faced in Europe, despite the fact that geographically, culturally, things are very different in the United States. I don't have any expectation that we would see the same sort of refugee crisis that the Europeans have. But certainly when you've had circumstances where you've had a lot of young men that are coming in independent of their families, that can change things and have pretty serious consequences as well. So I think it's who of us, people who have my perspective on these issues, to grapple with some of the tougher challenges associated with immigration. So I don't know if you've got anything you want to add. Coleman. I speak for Coleman. So.
Sure. Last but certainly not least, let's talk about Asian Americans. Very often, Asian Americans are not in the conversation other than to sort of present them as the model minority. Now, I grew up in California with a very long history of Asian Americans, going all the way back to the early and mid 1800s. And Asians are not silent. They are very much a fabric of life in the West. So, what do you think the impact of some of the things that we're seeing in terms of affirmative action that you touched on earlier? We see it here in New York City in terms of the top tier schools, which are 100% merit-based. Wherever you score on the list, you have your choice of some of the prime schools in the city. Where do you think Asian Americans fit in, given some of the blanket stereotypes about them being sort of the most affluent minority? There is some nuance there that people don't discuss. What is your understanding or your feelings about how Asians fit in this conversation?
Well, if you're going to claim that every Asian is wealthier than every white person, then yes, I'd agree that's a stereotype. But if you're just going to look at statistics about the mean and the median, then it's absolutely true to say that the average Asian American earns more money by not a small amount than the average white person. Even when you hold socioeconomics constant, you find that Asian Americans tend to outperform white Americans in the education system. And it presents a little bit of a problem for certain left-wing orthodoxies. For instance, that every culture values every single thing equally and has the exact same kinds of cultural patterns. And you can even, again, Asian Americans, that's an umbrella term. So if you just look at the specific ethnic groups, Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans tend to earn much more money than, for example, Hmong Americans, which are an ethnic group from Southeast Asia, who earn they're at the bottom of the list, below African Americans in terms of income per capita. So the cultural differences between ethnicities under an umbrella term matters. But yeah, I think in general, Asian Americans have presented a bit of a problem for progressive orthodoxies because Asian Americans have been treated quite poorly in this country. From the alien land laws in the first half of the 20th century, which specifically prevented Japanese Americans from owning the land that they worked in 14 different states, to the internment of Japanese during World War II, to the fact that affirmative action discriminates against Asian Americans, which is to say, take the identical candidate of Asian American heritage and a white candidate, a black candidate. Asian American is least likely to get into an elite school, then the white American, then blacks and Hispanics are very most likely. A few weeks ago, a big scandal broke, widely reported in the New York Times, that Harvard, it seems that Harvard has been artificially deflating Asians' personality scores in order to keep their numbers down, in much the same way that was done with Jews in the first half of the 20th century, because the Ivy Leagues feared that they would become too Jewish if they judged everyone by the same standards. Likewise, I saw in the New York Times editorial piece from a few weeks ago talking about the elite schools in the high schools in New York City, and there's kind of a throwaway line about Asians in New York, saying that many of them are disproportionately poor and, quote, scrimp on essentials like food in order to pay for test prep. And then in the same paragraph...
Is that a criticism?
In the same paragraph, it presented that as if it were somehow an advantage that Asian Americans had that poor blacks and Hispanics don't, right? So it was dealing with the objection, why are you discriminating against Asians when some of them are extremely poor? And it has this throwaway line about how some of these families are literally scrimping on food in order to pay for test prep. But we can't expect blacks and Hispanics to do the same thing. So you just can't. Okay, you could call that an advantage, but it just seems to me that my main point here is that basically in our conversation about race, many liberals and progressives have absolutely no problem behaving unethically and in ways that we should all find objectionable towards Asian Americans because they happen to be successful despite not having had virtually any benefits conferred on them in history. And it dissociates the variable of historical treatment from success in the present, which is a sacred dogma, I would argue, in the progressive orthodoxy on race. And like, for example, the president of my university, Columbia, was asked a few days ago about the Harvard scandal and what he thought about it. And his response was basically, well, Harvard didn't use official quotas on Asians, so they didn't do anything wrong. That's it. That was the thrust of his response. No condemnation for the fact that they've been artificially deflating scores on personality tests, hiding data on how they keep their numbers of Asians low. No honesty about the subject. And a lot of Asian Americans, I think, are sick of it, as evidenced by the lawsuit that they brought against Harvard. So those are my thoughts there.
Yeah, I'll be brief here. I think a distinction that I've come to realize about my own perspective on these issues versus the perspective of a lot of folks who tend to agree with me on stuff like this, or who I tend to be in conversation with, like Coleman, and even John McWhorter, Glenn Lowry, actually I've never talked to, but read his stuff, is that I am decidedly like an abolitionist when it comes to race, and not a reformer. And as a general rule, I think even the premise of certain questions and of certain observations with respect to Asian performance and effectively what the fundamental problem is with the policy at Harvard that discounts you in some way, shape, or form on account of your Asianness isn't so much that it's discrimination against Asians and that we have to treat that group equally, equivalently. It's that we are not treating people as individuals, as acknowledging that their circumstances really do demand that. Whatever the uniformity of some experience within a particular group, it's only so uniform. There are going to be meaningful distinctions in every individual person's experience. And at the end of the day, my hope and aspiration is that we continue to move towards a place where we're acknowledging that more forthrightly. And to the extent that people do find themselves fed up on account of the rather obscene gymnastics that people have to do in order to conform to the same social justice, identity politics, orthodoxy, in order to deal with the weird contradictions that come up when you do have a minority group that as a whole, whatever the hell Asia means, it is such a weird, bizarre hodgepodge of distinct cultures and values, but whatever, accepting it for the moment, for the purposes of just getting through this set of remarks here. Whatever that means, I'm not sure how useful it is to make observations related to those things and to stop there. And I think we have a responsibility, if we want to have sophisticated policy discussions, to extend ourselves beyond that point. And in like manner, I don't think we can be content to have conversations about the various ways in which Black culture, for example, is challenged without acknowledging that whatever cultural values or patterns in culture exist, the ability for people to choose different cultures is still something that has to happen on an individual level. It's still something which will filter up to various communities and whatever other sort of tribal compartmentalizations we want to pay attention to. I think it's a meaningful distinction. I think it's an important insight. And I also could be wrong about that. So.
Okay, I had a follow-up, but I don't think I can top what you just said.
I don't even know what I just said.
That's great. So I'm actually going to throw it to the crowd. If anyone has questions. Sure.
Actually, well, if you guys don't mind, I was going to start and ask Coleman, because we spoke about a month ago, and you had your first article out at that time. And I think since then you've had 3 or 4. Since then, maybe 3. Since about 2 months ago. And I was looking you up on Twitter the other day, and I saw, holy shit, you're blowing up. People are mad at you. There's academics writing rebuttals to your stuff. And I was like, wow, this has been an amazing couple months for you. So I'm curious kind of how you've taken it. Is the kind of criticism you've seen expected? And Kmele, you were talking about earlier how he's going to have some issues in writing about this in the beginning. I'm curious kind of what your thoughts on in terms of his ascension within the scholarship.
It's interesting. I guess my first several articles, I got some criticisms, but nothing like the criticism I've gotten for my most recent article entitled "Black American Culture and the Racial Wealth Gap." But it's interesting, just saying the same message in 2 different mediums somehow, for many people, will change the message. So, for example, there is a Chappelle Show skit from the brilliant comedian Dave Chappelle from the 2000s, entitled something like "Reparations," where it's hilarious, and I recommend you all just type it into YouTube and watch it, where the central punchline is essentially poking fun at Black people for purchasing cars, jewelry, and expensive clothes. And what I did in the last piece is I cited publicly available data from Nielsen and from economists at UChicago and Wharton that found that Dave Chappelle's point of view on was actually not a stereotype, but was in fact correct. That Black people are more likely to buy a luxury car, and it's unconditional on wealth and income. More likely to buy jewelry, more likely to buy expensive clothes than white people. And that's a very uncomfortable topic. It's a deeply uncomfortable topic because people feel as if you are trafficking in old stereotypes about black people. And it's interesting when you make when you stop talking about other similar facts. For example, white people are far more likely to drive drunk than black people. I'm not sure why that is. It could be caused by many things. Also more likely to break liquor laws, public drunkenness. Which is not to say that culture is the only possible explanation. There could be geographical. I mean, there's like 100 different reasons why any given disparity could be the case. But I mean, there are even data points like there's some data points that it's hard to answer. What it could be other than culture, right? It's like black people watch 37% more television per day than this is from Nielsen than the second highest group, and that's like that difference represents like a few hours per day. It's hard to. Many people find it hard to confront these facts, or they want to pretend that every culture, on average, inculcates precisely the same values and the same exact behavioral patterns. And when somebody points out that actually it's not the case, it's never been the case, you can compare Black Americans to Black Caribbeans, you find massive differences on all kinds of metrics. So it's not actually about race at all. It's about culture, and many different cultures can be within the same race, right? So I've also cited data in my previous Quilette piece. Like one data point is that for every dollar earned by the average American of Russian descent, the average American of French descent earns just 79 cents. These are both white people, in other words, right? So it depends how you draw the lines. Circling back to your question, I pointed out, I touched a very taboo topic, which is, you can say the word culture, you can say the word black. The moment you say the word black culture, you have to follow it with only the good parts of black culture, like the music, I would argue, which is disproportionately, like if you want to just talk about the musical icons of the 20th century and who influenced the world music, you're going to be talking about a lot of black people. You're not going to be talking about very many Asian Americans. I think most of us know intuitively that these cultural differences exist, but when someone points them out with data, it's very uncomfortable for people, and they respond very emotional, I would argue.
I'll just share something that Coleman and I actually talked about briefly. I'll only share stuff that I said, not stuff he said. But as I was watching some of the fallout after his piece was published, I found myself sort of paying a lot of attention to the really aggressively critical stuff that was emanating from some of the more ascendant black intellectuals out there, folks like Kmele over at Slate. I believe he's also a ABC News contributor. And what stood out to me is the consistency with which you would find people who were simply being dismissive. They weren't willing to engage with the argument. They were interested in perhaps quibbling with small things, which, as Coleman just highlighted, focusing on the use of black culture and suggesting that he made no sort of distinction as to what that was. That's a knee-jerk criticism. I think, to Coleman's credit, he actually does offer some very specific things that people do that one might say are a component of what we could comprise as culture. I think the fact is that he leveled an argument, and to the extent he is sourcing data and presenting it to us, I think it is who of those folks to actually confront him. But it is far easier to try and dismiss him, to try and denigrate his perspective. I think the challenge going forward for everyone who articulates heterodox perspectives in public, Coleman included, to the extent that I'm charging him at all, it's to really, really have your shit tight. Like, you can't be sloppy at all, because the small errors that you make are the things that they blow up out of all proportion, as if it were the fundamental driving force of your argument. You spend your time writing something that ought to take a thoughtful person well over an hour to read and consult some of the sources, and they think in 140 characters, old Twitter, they can just decimate it and it doesn't matter anymore. I am severely critical of Ta-Nehisi Coates' work. I don't think you can dismiss the whole of it in 140 characters. I don't think you can dismiss the whole of it in one book. There are points that he makes that are fair and reasonable. Neither I or Coleman or anyone else would disagree with the fundamental claim that slavery has something to do with the distribution of wealth in this country today. Something. The difficulty here, the challenge is trying to quantify it. And so far as I can tell, there's really only one side, so to speak, that's making really grandiose, seemingly unsupportable claims about the degree to which historical legacy and nothing else is to blame for the current circumstances that we find ourselves in. Historical circumstances actually having contemporary consequences is not so ridiculous or absurd. It's also not crazy for there to be contemporary challenges that are not only historically rooted. So.
Hi, my name is Leah Falco, and I have two questions actually, but I'll be quick. The first one is kind of a continuation of Jordan's question, which is directed at Mr. Hughes here, which is just what it's like, what kind of reaction you've got given your unorthodox views. Being a Columbia University student, I'd love to know how that's affected your social situation and what kind of reaction you got. But also, I'd like to ask you both, whether you think that Obama's presidency had positive or negative effect. I know that's a big question, but I thought that Obama had a golden opportunity to make things better for race relations in the country, and I just want to know whether you think that he did or didn't, and how.
First question, it's summer right now, so I'm not at school. I'll answer it again in the fall. Second question, I wasn't a politically aware enough person during the Obama years to have really been able to weigh the good things he said, the bad things he said, and spit out the equation as to whether he was good. But I've heard him say things that are just like totally reasonable. And just a few days ago, he said in his South Africa speech, you cannot dismiss someone's argument because they're white or because they're male. I think it's great that he says things like that, and I find him to be much more reasonable than he's generally made out to be on the right, much less quote race baiting, which is a epithet that's often thrown at him. Which is not to say that everything he said about the relationship, for example, between blacks and the police was well thought through. But as far as politicians go, I find Barack Obama to be really the paradigm of rationality. Moreover, I think the fact that he's talked about a phenomenon like black kids accusing each other of acting white for doing well in school, for example. Michelle Obama has also talked about growing up and experiencing this epidemic. I think insofar as an icon like Obama can make discussions of behaviors that black kids disproportionately engage in that are self-destructive, insofar as that they can make that conversation easier, and insofar as they have, I think that's all to the good too.
I'm not going to talk about my collegiate experience because that was a long time ago and I wasn't asked about that. But with respect to Barack Obama, I often refer back to this moment when he was still a candidate for president. This is back when people who would eventually become his supporters were still talking about the fact that Obama wasn't black enough, that he wasn't one of us. He had a white mother, his dad was from Africa. He couldn't connect with us at all, whoever else is. And there was a moment where someone asked him, a supporter of his, in a rally, You know, my friends tell me that you're black, but I tell them, you know, you have a white mom, a black mother. I mean, you're not black, you're both. How do you self-identify? And he, if you see the video of this, I mean, he literally is like leaping at the opportunity to define himself. And he says, I'm so glad you asked that question. I want to tell you, you know, I self-identify as black, and I'm very proud of that. It's how I'm viewed, and it's how I'm treated. Okay, that was Barack Obama from the outset. I think Coleman is absolutely right. Barack Obama has oftentimes been enormously reasonable. He has oftentimes pushed back against the sentiment of investing yourself with too much of the past, or holding on to past hatreds, or disqualifying people's perspectives because they don't have the right gender or race. All of that said, his opportunity to do that and really have a meaningful impact, so far as I'm concerned, was probably when he was president. And there were far too many times where he had that opportunity, and rather than confronting that stuff forcefully, he just rode the wave. Most of those things were related to criminal justice reform. I don't begrudge people who want to see reforms. I do too. I think that most of the conversation about race with respect to criminal justice reform has been counterproductive and not productive, and the Obama administration owns some of that burden. Worse yet, they have this thing, the 21st Century Task Force on Policing. The Obama administration disregarded, Obama Justice Department disregarded the administration's own commission's findings about the sorts of changes that would have had a profound impact on the quality of our justice system. His legacy is quite checkered. May in fact be that he is the sort of quintessential politician, but it's a qualified endorsement because politicians generally suck. Very sophisticated take.
Hey guys, Kmele, I've got a chance to know you, big fan of yours, and Coleman, your work as well, and Rock, I'm definitely going to check you out. I just want to say, I've developed views about race and opinions, but the thing that I worry about is that I was born and raised in New York City, and my opinions have been formed in the relative, cosmopolitan, safe world of New York City. I don't anticipate being the victim of racial violence. And what I worry about is there a blind spot that can form because I come from this milieu? And is there something I'm missing from my purview? I just had the chance I drove back to the South with my brother, and I'm not trying to disparage the South, but I'm just thinking what if I grew up somewhere else, and what if there are towns that are smaller or rural where people can be, harassed or abused by whatever powers exist there? Is this something that you think about, and if so, to that end, do you pursue any, across ideological lines, any other thinkers who might talk about this stuff? I'm thinking about, Rowdy Bach or the Marshall Project or Tim Wise or something like this.
Yeah, I'm certainly sensitive to that concern, having grown up in a very cosmopolitan. I grew up in the suburbs of New York, so it's certainly possible to be blinded by one's experience. So I think it would be extraordinarily hubristic to suggest that it's not possible that I could be blinded by some kind of bias in my opinion. I don't think anyone can honestly claim that it's not possible that they are. The reason I'm not that concerned about it is because I think the moment anything racist happens in this country, there is an enormous incentive for someone from the New York Times to be there. So that is the incentive structure facing people in the mainstream media. If something happens, if something racist happens and someone in the New York Times isn't there, that's to their disadvantage to such a degree that I don't expect to be missing out on racism that is in fact there. If anything, just my reading of mainstream media outlets like the Times, which is my main source. It's a newspaper I go to first every day. My experience there is that there are often incidences of arguable racism or not at all racism that get reported as racism, which suggests to me if I just read the New York Times and get my sense of what the ambient level of racism in the country is from there, I'm likely to be overestimating, not underestimating, given the incentive structure. That incentive structure would have been the same in 1930. In fact, it almost certainly would have been the exact opposite. But I think that is the case, yeah.
Thank you.
So I've noticed both from some polling or survey data that certain groups have a reluctance to admit or concede a point to what they conceive to be their opposite number. So, like recently, there's been a poll that shows that a majority of Republicans have a strongly favorable idea of Donald Trump, although some data might suggest otherwise, that there is a considerable amount of Republicans who don't see him in such a favorable light, and like there have been some kind of I guess you could say opinions proffered to suggest that this is done because Republicans have a very skeptical view of the media, and they don't want to concede to what they perceive to be a very biased group, that their candidate might have some faults. And it's been my personal experience, and there's some data to support the idea that Black Americans are very reticent to concede the fact that there may be some cultural issues at play to like in the popular discussion. So one data point is that like when polled, African Americans who have been subject to traffic stops will overwhelmingly say that the cop who stopped them for valid reasons, though there still persists this idea that Black Americans are often solely targeted because of their race when traffic stops are. So I'm just curious, like what you think might be at play here, and like, what might be done to remedy this at all.
Yeah, sure. That's really interesting. I actually hadn't heard that polling data. But it also, I guess there are some polls that suggest that on certain questions, there's really virtually no taboo amongst Black people about talking about culture. For instance, there's a Pew poll from 2008, which I learned this in a Ta-Nehisi Coates essay. I read them, and I actually enjoy reading them. But anyway, neither here nor there. The point is, there's a Pew poll from 2008 which asked the question, do you think rap has been a bad influence on society? The percentage of Black people that said yes was, I believe, 71%. So majority viewpoint, I'm sure if you disaggregated the data by age, you would find like for above a certain age, it's like virtually 100%, and below a certain age, there's clearly age effect, but right, you can't be racist to have that opinion if the majority of Black people have it, is the first observation, or it's at least it's very unlikely that it's racist. The second observation is that sounds very much like a quote cultural explanation of something to me. If you're going to say rap has a bad influence on society, you are citing a cultural factor, mainly rap, and saying that it matters, i.e. it has an influence, and a bad one. So, to me, that's just one example. Obviously, I'm not sure that many academics are eager to do polls asking Black people what they think about cultural factors, because if the answer comes out a certain way and you want to write that paper, you're putting your career on the line a little bit. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Anyway.
The one thing I'd add to that is just the prevalence, people's beliefs about the prevalency of discrimination versus their reported experience in terms of experiencing it. There tends to be a pretty significant delta between those two things among amongst Black people as well. And the Knight Foundation actually has an interesting study that they've done across a couple of years now related to speech on campus. And one of the questions that they ask actually pertains to the sort of racial climate on their campus and the racial climate in general on campuses. And everyone acknowledges that, generally speaking, people have a much more favorable view of their own campus and its racial tolerance, but they are very concerned about the racial climate on other campuses, which leads one to believe that perhaps there is the perception of a problem that might exist, or beliefs about a problem that exists globally, that people don't necessarily see a tremendous amount of experience for their own lives. And I think that is suggestive of something as well.
We actually only have time for one more question, but I highly recommend that everyone follows Mr. Coleman Hughes and Mr. Kmele Foster on Twitter. I'm sure they're more than happy to answer. Well, maybe I shouldn't speak for them. But there will be opportunities to ask more questions and sort of expand this dialogue. This is not a one-off. So great.
My name is Matthew Lichtash. First of all, thank you, three, for being here and taking the time tonight. Very enjoyed it. My question is for Kmele. So I was listening to The Fifth Column, which is Kmele's podcast. Everyone should listen to it. It's great. A couple weeks ago. Shameless plug. And you had on Ben Dreyfuss, who is an editor at Mother Jones, I believe. And the topic of Sam Harris's conversation, if you could call it that, with Ezra Klein came up. And at the end of it, he basically went off in a tirade and said Sam Harris is wrong, stupid, an idiot, and racist. I think all four of those words came up. You can.
Sounds about right.
And to your credit, you said I very much disagree with that. My question is, how can we better foster productive dialogue? Could you see yourself getting Coleman to have a discussion with Jamel Bowie on the podcast, Sam Harris to have a discussion with Ben Dreyfuss? How do we take out the contempt, which is really what I hear in the way that Ben Dreyfuss described Sam Harris, in the way that Jamel described Coleman to a lesser extent, but Quilette as a whole? So how can we take contempt out and foster productive conversation?
Try to model good conversations. Try to model honest discourse. And I think something that actually Claire, the founder of Quilette, mentioned to me when we were having a conversation about a weekend and a half ago. I think amongst people who value free inquiry, who value honest discourse, a bit more bravery on our parts in terms of being willing to make arguments that are going to require us to endure a barrage of arrows being sent our way. And recognizing that, yeah, in some cases it's going to be awful. In other cases it will not be nearly as bad as you suspect. I think that modeling in both respects is critical to trying to create a culture where there's greater reciprocity. So.
It sounds like Sam Harris and Ezra Klein were attempting to do exactly what you're saying, which is to say, to bridge the gap between, well, to talk about the bridge, at the very least, between people who have very different perspectives. And, I listened to that conversation. In my view, it's not clear to me that, what could Sam have done there to make that go better? Not nothing. But it's hard when if you're someone who's like willing to talk to whomever, and you find that this group of people over here, when you happen to talk to them, happen to call you a racist quite frequently. Obviously, that's not a reason to talk to them less, but you can see how a person with just like a normal rational level of self-concern can find themselves tending to not speak with that. I think we have to hold people accountable who call people racist who aren't. I think praise and blame are levers we can pull to influence behavior in our social lives and on social media. I think it's not okay. We have to make it. We have to make it seem people have to pay a reputational cost for making false accusations of racism, and I don't know how we get that feature of our culture to improve exactly, other than obviously I think people should model charity, but it's definitely it's a hard problem, and I don't have a straightforward answer.
I'm actually going to ask Quilette, let everyone know what was on his mind. I think something Coleman said sort of piqued your interest there at the end a little bit.
No, I think it's the notion of people paying the cost for making false allegations of racism. I mean, I think, yes, it'd be great if they did. To the extent that they don't, engaging with people with, in some cases, sort of extraordinary grace, and saying, what does that mean? What do you mean when you say that? To the extent Sam had done more of that, quite frankly, like he's already putting himself out there, he's already being vulnerable. I think the opportunity to have a more robust conversation with Ezra, where he actually has to substantiate allegations like that and charges like that, probably puts him in a stronger position and might even create more opportunities for some of those conversations. It's interesting. I'm remembering a moment. I moderated a bunch of panels for Heterodox Academy the other day, and we were having a conversation about the classroom, and these three professors were explaining how they create environments for healthy discourse and conversation in the classrooms. And they all said, well, we teach people that when you hurt someone's feelings, you ought to apologize and take responsibility for it. And the question I asked it both in the preparatory conversation and during the panel, and during the preparatory conversation, it just didn't really sink in, I don't think. But when do you encourage your students to be more resilient? Like at what point? And I think we have to own the same thing. Like, I don't give a shit if you call me an Oreo or an Uncle Tom or a house nigga. Like, maybe it stings a little bit, but it's up to me to be a bit more resilient and to deal with that. And it's certainly true that racist is the most potent thing that you can aim at someone in terms of a sort of social stigma that you attach to them. But as Sam Harris demonstrates, quite frankly, it's possible to survive that, to proceed beyond it, and to the extent we can be brave and be supportive of people who are taking those kinds of stands. I think that is almost certainly the best possible medicine. And yes, calling people out when they make those allegations baselessly is good, but I think we can find ways to do it that are healthy. So I don't even know that that's so much a disagreement. I'm not sure we disagree there at all.
Okay. Unfortunately, that's our time for tonight. We've been talking about this conversation for the past 230 or so years.
We finished it.
Yeah, but I'm sure there's always things that we can add. I really just want to extend my appreciation to these gentlemen, not only meeting me this evening and having this discussion, but obviously the previous week, not this previous week, but a couple of weeks ago, we were able to get together, have lunch, and I just want to extend my appreciation, not just for sharing your thoughts and ideas in this forum, but just being in the world and not shying away from tough conversations, and as you were saying, Kmele, modeling sort of an ideal of how we can live better and have these conversations in a respectful way, and move forward and see what we can build tomorrow. So with that, I'm going to close it, and really appreciate the audience, and good night.
Maybe we should probably shut the feed off and then we'll let that keep it. I think we should shut the camera.